Okay, so there was another story I really wanted to talk about, and it involves Al Jazeera. Now, if you're not familiar, Al Jazeera is a Middle Eastern news or a broadcasting company. And it's funny, some of you may remember how a few years back, maybe, I don't know, the way time flies, Al Gore started his own TV network called Current. And for a while, the Young Turks had a show on there. It was kind of nice as a TYT fan. You know, come 7 o'clock at night, you can flip on the TV and watch the Young Turks again after having, watched their videos or listened to their podcast earlier in the day. But eventually the channel got bought out by Al Jazeera, and they dubbed the station Al Jazeera America. Most of the pre-existing programming, including the Young Turks, got the axe, but recently Al Jazeera started a YouTube channel called AJ Plus, and they're now partnering with the Young Turks. And this past week, I discovered a somewhat disturbing video on their channel. AJ Plus, not TYT. And I should say, it definitely seems like they're trying to cater to a younger audience, not that there's anything wrong with that. They've given it this catchy little name, AJ Plus. Most of the hosts or presenters, at least judging by looks, look like they're probably no older than their early 30s. And there was this one female presenter or host who was really smart and funny and not bad on the eyes. Am I allowed to say that? And but the presenters are these kind of youthful and charismatic people. But what I found troubling about the video in question, and this one was presented by a young guy with a goatee, probably of Middle Eastern descent, was that they announced a policy that Al Jazeera will not be using the word terrorist. They say it's too loaded and that one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. But why don't I let you listen to it, and keep in mind, since this is audio only, that they'll give 3 examples of terrorists. They basically flash images on the screen. And the last one they show is kind of like this gotcha thing, is Timothy McVeigh, a white guy. So just keep in mind when they say, and this guy, they're showing a picture of Timothy McVeigh, all right?
We're going to do something we hardly ever do at AJ Plus. Use the T word. Terrorist. It's our policy not to use the terms terrorist or terrorism to label a person, group, or action. We don't use them for this guy, or for this group, or even for this dude. Why not? Because the term is loaded.
The radical Muslim terrorists hell-bent on killing us.
After all, one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter, even though you might disagree. A lot of media outlets aren't consistent in the way they use the word terrorist. A Muslim gunman? Immediately labeled a terrorist, but a white guy who flies a plane into a government building? Was it terror or just anger? And some people love to overuse it.
Now, Mr. Obama is playing terrorist whack-a-mole.
To pal around with terrorists?
Is Hamas a terrorist organization?
We don't try to answer that question. Instead, we describe the person or group's actions and let you guys make your own conclusions. Like when we covered the Charlie Hebdo attacks, we described them this way.
Gunmen stormed the office of satirical magazine Charlie Hebdo, reportedly opening fire on an editorial meeting and saying the Prophet Muhammad had been avenged.
And even though the US government calls Hamas a terrorist organization, we describe them this way.
Hamas is a Palestinian political movement with an armed wing called the Izz ad-Din al-Qassam Brigades.
Wordy, perhaps, but accurate. The general meaning of terrorism has changed over the last century. It once referred to revolutionary movements, and then repressive governments. But today, there's actually no universal definition of terrorism, and the UN has been working on it for over 20 years. The US Department of Defense does have a definition, though. They say terrorism is the unlawful use of violence or threat of violence, often motivated by religious, political, or other ideological beliefs to instill fear and coerce governments or societies in pursuit of goals that are usually political. That's not broad at all. Oh, and the State Department and FBI? They have other definitions. We've decided not to use these labels, and we're not alone. Reuters has also banned these terms, and the BBC avoids them when they can. As with every rule, there is one exception. You might hear us use the T word when we attribute it to someone else, like when Lupe Fiasco says this.
My fight against terrorism, to me, the biggest terrorist is Obama.
You bet we'll cover it. Words have a lot of meaning, and we want to make sure that we're getting it right. So how are we doing? Let us know.
All right, so there it is. Now, the argument about isn't one man's terrorist another man's freedom fighter, seems very thin to me, and it smacks of intellectual dishonesty. There's a certain, perhaps, grain of truth in it, in the sense that if you have a nation with a corrupt government that's engulfed in chaos and military strife, and you have rebels storming buildings, etc., then maybe, yeah, who's a terrorist and who's a freedom fighter might be up for debate. But armed people entering an office and slaughtering people because they don't like the cartoons they're drawing, that's terrorism. Taking defenseless hostages and sawing their heads off, that's terrorism. And what point are they trying to prove with McVeigh? I consider McVeigh a domestic terrorist. I consider abortion clinic bombers terrorists. Everyone called IRA bombings acts of terrorism. So the word terrorist isn't some Muslim smear, at least not for me. It's an accurate description of people who perpetrate heinous acts against civilians in the hope of frightening or demoralizing the other side. And I don't care what the ethnicity or religion of the perpetrator is. Does it happen to be that the majority of terrorist acts in the news today seem to be committed by Muslim extremists? Yes, and well, too bad, that just seems to be the case. It doesn't mean I think all Muslims are terrorists, of course not. And I do feel bad that decent nonviolent Muslims are possibly being stigmatized by the actions of a radical minority. But this PC stuff is just ridiculous. Terrorist is an accurate descriptor for the people who commit these types of barbarous acts. And I don't think they're doing anyone any favors by trying to whitewash their vocabulary. There's almost something creepily Orwellian about it.